Me presento, yo soy Gustavo Iglesias de Radio 3 y bueno, estoy aquí en este caso invitado para moderar o conducir un poquito pues este panel para celebrar los 50 años de Aladdin Sane de David Bowie. Para esto contamos con tres personas, tres auténticos expertos en la figura de Bowie, como son Pegg, Geoff Marsh y también Duffy, que es un poco el representante de Duffy Archive, que es un poco la institución que conserva y divulga pues el legado de su padre, el fotógrafo Brian Duffy, responsable de estas icónicas imágenes que todos conocemos. Y el problema es que Chris está teniendo una serie de terribles percances aeroportuarios, entonces va a llegar un poquito más tarde, pero podemos empezar con Nicholas y con Jeffrey. Deciros que todo el acto va a tener lugar en inglés, así que espero que nuestros niveles de inglés estén lo suficientemente... Bueno, ellos hablan un inglés muy correcto y les vamos a pedir que hablen despacito. No creo que haya ningún problema en que les entendamos. Y sin más, empezamos ya. Muchísimas gracias y empezamos ya directamente. Ok, me voy a sentar aquí. Okay, good evening and thanks everybody for being here and welcome to this panel, Aladdin Sane 50 years, celebrating the 50th anniversary of one of David Bowie's masterpieces, Aladdin Sane, and also, of course, its iconic album cover. In the context of this incredible exhibition, Bowie taken by Duffy and presenting this incredible book, Aladdin Sane, 50 years, Aladdin Sane 50 años, published in Spain by Planeta, which also commemorates this anniversary, including an amazing graphic story of the historic photographic session by Brian Duffy, and a written recount of many aspects regarding this album, historical, cultural, visual, and of course, musical. At this table, or at these chairs, we're going to have three of the contributors or authors of the book, and three experts in many of those aspects surrounding the life and work of David Bowie. Chris Duffy, the son of Brian Duffy, and representing the Duffy Archive, an institution devoted to promoting the work of his father and to which we owe this book and this exhibition. Chris will be with us in a few minutes. I think he's had a little problem with his flight. But here with me, we can already say hello to Nicholas Pegg. Yeah, come this way, Nicholas Pegg, director, actor, writer. Hi, Nick. Nice to see you. And also author of The Complete David Bowie, highly regarded as one of the best books ever published about David Bowie. And also Geoff Marsh. Hi, Jeffrey. Jeffrey is the director of the Theatre and Performing Arts Department of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Therefore, responsible for curating the exhibition David Bowie Is, which opened in London in March 2013 and ended 5 years later after being seen by more than 2 million people in 12 museums all around the world, including El Museu de Disseny in Barcelona in 2017. So while Chris comes, I'd like to say hello to you and thank you so much for being here.
Hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having us.
And celebrating the 50 years of Aladdin Sane, I would like maybe to start by asking you a personal question, possibly asking you to remember where were you 50 years ago, what your relationship with this particular album and with David Bowie at that time was. I don't know if you remember, maybe seeing the album cover in a record store, maybe seeing David Bowie a year before in that famous performance in the TV show Top of the Pops. What's your initiation story with Bowie?
Shall I go first? Okay, well, I'm not trying to boast, but I am a little bit younger than Geoff. So 50 years ago, I was about this tall. No, I was, what was I? I was 6 years old. So I didn't really, at the time, I was a little bit too young to be there for David Bowie's kind of Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane.
I'm sure at some point you both came across with...
Oh, of course. So later on, I first became aware of David Bowie, probably not long after that, actually, about maybe the following year. I think Rebel Rebel is the first song I can really remember as a young child, hearing that and liking it. But yeah, so I was a bit young. But so I really became a big fan of David Bowie later on, in my early teens, in the early 1980s. Of course, I was aware of him by then, and I'd heard a lot of his songs. And the first one I really remember really making an impression on me was when I saw him performing "Boys Keep Swinging" on TV in 1979 on the Kenny Everett show, which was a big show in the UK at the time. So Aladdin Sane, anyway, to answer your question, I mean, yeah, I became aware of it, as a young teenager, and obviously I'd seen the picture because it's such a famous picture, but I didn't actually put the album on and hear those amazing songs until I was probably 14, 15, something like that. And yeah, of course, like so many people before and since, it made an instant impact on me. So yeah, I mean, how could it fail to? Yeah,
it's interesting how this album. I don't know. Many people know the cover even more than the songs. We'll talk about that later. Geoff, what's your story with Bowie?
So I'm a lot older than Nick. I was 16. So my girlfriend got me to dye my hair during COVID lockdown. So I actually have white hair. So I hope I look a bit younger, but that's why I've got a few years.
Well, you got more hair than me, that's for sure. I mean, yeah.
So, I have to admit, I was into prog rock in the early 70s, but there were two boys in my school who were Bowie fanatics, and they used to stand in the playground at the break time, and they used to hold David Bowie albums. And we always used to go and shout rude things at them, I have to admit. So I only really got interested in David in the late 70s because I had a friend who was into krautrock, and I got interested in him then. But we've just had a little exhibition in London as well about the 50th anniversary, and lots of people have written their memories about when it came out. And there's a lovely story about a town in the north of England. It's very, very industrial. It's quite a kind of Rust Belt town. Does that make it in Spanish, Rust Belt? It's very run down, industrial. Yeah. But in those days, they had a record shop, and he was 13, and he was walking along the street with his mother, and he looked in the entire record shop, because the record shops in those days was full of the album cover. And his mother just walked straight by. She didn't even notice it. And he was just transfixed by this image at 13. And he looked up the road, and his mother was sort of, and so she came along and she took one look at the window, grabbed his hand and dragged him up the street to get him away from this terrible image. So I'm not sure, I'm trying to guess how many of you may remember it at the time. Maybe a few of you when it came out. And of course the other thing was the next year Diamond Dogs came out, and the album cover of that at the time was considered much more offensive because he was shown as a dog and it was banned in America. And yet this is one that's lived right the way through to the present day.
Mm-hmm. In any case, either if you were there when the album came out, or you were aware of it a few years later, such as Nick or myself, or I'm sure many other people, it is true that this image strikes you in a very particular way. And this is part of the story of this book and also this exhibition. But in this book in particular, well, you've both contributed with a few articles about different aspects. In your case, Geoff, you've written the article in which you tell what the session with Brian Duffy happened. What happened that day in January 1973, and how these two people, Brian Duffy was already a very well-established photographer. He had already taken pictures of many famous musicians. He was in the fashion photography business. He had just finished the Pirelli calendar, if I'm not wrong, which also has some kind of relation to this session. So what happened that day in that particular studio in London in 1973?
Well, just a bit of back. How many of you been to London recently? A few. So it's obviously not as fashionable as Madrid, but London now is kind of okay. But it's difficult to imagine now how run down London was in the 1970s. The population of London just before the Second World War was 9 million. And then because of bombing, people moved out. And all the way through the 1960s and the 1970s, the population went down. So by the 1980s, the population of London was 6 million. So it lost a third of its population. So when I was growing up in London, there were streets of empty houses, abandoned churches, all sorts of things just boarded up. And so if you were a young person, it was great. You could live virtually for nothing. You could just squat in houses. And Brian's studio, where this was taken, was in an area now which is super expensive. In fact, his studio was pulled down and they built luxury housing on the site. But in those days, right in the centre of London, you could get a film studio or something like that very cheaply. So it's a very, very different sort of London. No internet, no social media, no internet at all. And in fact, the year this came out, probably two things. It was the year that Britain went into the common market, into the European Union. We both voted to stay. We didn't want to come out. But it was the year that we finally got in. And at that time, only 45% of houses in Britain even had a telephone. So this was a world where communication between young people was very difficult. So album covers were how people could communicate. So David had 5 albums out already. This is his 6th album. This was his first when he was already a star. So he was looking for a very, very dramatic image. And his manager at the time, Tony DeFries, wanted to get him successful in America. So they needed a cover that would be dramatic, different, radical, but wouldn't get censored. Because in America, if they didn't like the covers, they just, talk about censorship.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Duffy, straight off the plane.
You can carry on the answering the question, but I'll tell you what it is.
Hello, does this work? It does. My apologies. It's taken me 28 hours to get here. 2 cancelled flights. Unbelievable. Yeah. And 2.5 hours sleep. So I can answer anything
At all.
except flights.
We were just talking. Gustavo just asked us about.
Jeffrey was started telling us how the session of the Aladdin Sane album cover took place.
So David had come back from being in America, and he had a couple of months in England around Christmas 1972. But he was finishing off his tour, his Ziggy Stardust tour. He was finishing off the record. So the shoot was done at a weekend. It was sort of there was such little time, and Brian had already photographed David the previous year, but the photographs were never used, so they're in the exhibition. So they had actually met, and I think the interesting thing, and this is where perhaps you want to come in, is that Brian was used to doing fashion shoots and portrait photography, where there'd be stuff brought in, furniture or backdrops or all that sort of thing. But for this, there was nothing. So David came in and had clearly decided at some level he was just going to use his naked body as the work of art. And then what happened?
Well, yes.
Well, actually, unlike Nick and Jeffrey, Chris was there.
I wasn't at the shoot,
you met David a few days before the session, didn't you? So
I was around at the time, but I wasn't working for Duffy at the time, so I didn't assist him. But I'd met David at that time, and he was coming round for dinner on a kind of regular basis. So yes, I was party to it. But Jeff's correct. Duffy had first worked with David in 1972 when Tony DeFries had taken David on. He'd recognised, obviously, his immense talent. And he conjured up a plan to make David a superstar. Up until that point, David had worked more or less exclusively with photographer Mick Rock. But Tony wanted a change. And so he put David together with 3 photographers, David Bailey, Sakita, and Duffy, to see how that would work. And it turned out that David and Duffy got on like a house on fire. They had a lot of similar interests and viewpoints. And so that first session, which in fact actually David was wearing the Freddie Moretti outfit that he wore on Top of the Pops. None of those sessions were ever used. They were just purely as just test shots. So when I found them in the archive, they were very disparate, and we had a few transparencies in different boxes, and I'm surprised they were actually there. I thought that'd be something Duffy would throw away. Anyway, by the time we got to 73 in Aladdin Sane, it was obvious that Duffy was going to be the choice photographer. And Tony had worked with Duffy as well, and knew his approach to things and knew he was a world-class photographer. David and Duffy met, and Duffy said, "What's the album called?" And David said, "Aladdin Sane." And Duffy reworked it in his head, Aladdin Sane, which of course is not a word. And so the legend began. Geoff's correct. There were no props, no special effects in a day pre-digital. And the only one element that David wanted in the album cover was this flash. And David had really kind of hijacked that from Elvis. He was a massive Elvis fan. And Elvis had used this symbol on the back of his jet. He had a flash, he had signet rings he gave his band. And he'd started this, it was called Templars of the Christian Brotherhood, and the acronym was TCB, taking care of business in a flash. And so David was fascinated with this flash, and that was the one element that he brought to Duffy. De Vries knew that, and of course, I suppose this is something else about David. He was very astute at connecting with people that he knew would move his ideas forward. So everyone he's ever worked with has always brought something to the party, things that he couldn't do, but they've added to the mix. And Tony knew that Duffy would bring something special. So that was the only element, really, was this flash. Again, the shoot was very last minute. I think Tony said to Duffy, "We've got to shoot this on the weekend," like on a Monday. And Duffy said, "Well, I need a great makeup artist." And at that time, there were very few really good fashion makeup artists around. The top player was a lady called Barbara Daly, who'd worked with a photographer called Barry Latigan and done a lot of really beautiful work for Vogue, beauty shots. And so Duffy tried to get Barbara Daly on the shoot, and she wasn't available. On the Wednesday, he was doing an advertorial shoot for Revlon, and the makeup artist was Pierre Laroche. And Duffy, not having really many other options, said to Pierre, "What are you doing on the weekend?" And Pierre said nothing. He said, "Do you want to do a shoot?" So Pierre got pulled in, and after a couple of hours of discussing in the studio exactly how they were going to shoot the cover, they got the flash idea, and Duffy pulled out a rice cooker that his mother had given him that was in the studio that had a flash on it. It was made by National Panasonic, and their symbol was a flash at the time with red and blue, and he showed it to David, and they agreed on the color scheme. Pierre set about putting a flash on David's face, and up until that point, you'll see pictures of David gigging where he had like a little anchor on his face. And Pierre put a little flash on David's face. Duffy looked at it and said, "Take that off, that's completely wrong." And he picked up a makeup red lipstick from Pierre's box and drew the outline of the flash on David's face and said, "Fill that in." So that really was it. It was very straightforward. It was very simple. Duffy shot, I think, probably 2, maybe 3 maximum rolls of film. And it's extraordinary, really, when you think, I mean, I put in the book, who could have known on that day that one shot out of those rolls of film would become a cultural icon?
Yeah.
And I think everyone tries to kind of reinvent, work back how that happened. But at the time, it was just another job for Duffy. You know, it was executed in a very professional manner. He understood David's approach to things, and that, as Geoff said, being a fashion photographer, he understood design, colour, composition, and I think all of those things come through, plus much more. I mean, having looked at the image now, all of us, for 50 years, it's still haunting, it still has resonance. Is it a death mask? What is it? It's an extraordinary image. And I think if you rewind 50 years, it was really quite revolutionary at the time. And again, this idea, I don't know if you discussed it, with the eyes closed in conventional portraiture, but that was something that was really quite moving as well, with the eyes
this is
being
actually
closed.
something that Nick was pointing out just before starting, because I don't know, a few pictures were taken, and we can see them, basically all of them, or many of them in the book. And also in the exhibition, different angles, different positions. The album cover could have been easily this one, with David Bowie's eyes open, but it ended up being, well, the one you already know. Definitely one of the most iconic images in the history of pop music, if not the most iconic, as Chris often calls it, the Mona Lisa of pop. But you wanted to say something about the eyes closed.
I think it's one of it's a classic example of David Bowie's way of working. As Chris just said, Bowie had a wonderful. He was wonderfully open-minded about the contribution of other people. When he called in someone else to work with, someone like Duffy, he relished the fact that this was a talented person who could be given their own space to do something. And he was like that with musicians as well. You know, he didn't hire people and then tell them what to do. He wasn't interested in that. He hired people to see what they could bring to him. And if he didn't like it, he said, that's not quite right, try something else. And then he'd go, yes, do that. But he was allowing and encouraging other people to bring their talent to the table. And you know, so it was a collaboration in that respect. And one of the many little miracles, I think, that we see on the cover of Aladdin Sane is the process, and we could talk more about that maybe in a moment, but the choice, as you say, the actual choice of photograph. Now that we have seen, and it's only in the last few years that the other photos came to light, weren't they? That it was only really when Kevin Can was doing his book and he asked you to open up your archives, and this was only, 15 years ago, something like that?
Well, that was the only image of Aladdin Sane that was seen for 43 years.
Yeah.
And when I released the eyes open image for Kevin, I said, because Kevin came to the studio, he called me up. Kevin Can was doing his book Any Day Now, and he called me up and he said, it's up to 1973. Do you have any more pictures of David? And I said, yes, I've got the the original transparencies. Come over. Kevin came over to the studio. I put them out on the light box. And his eyes came out on organ stops. He was just absolutely amazed that there was more images. And he saw the eyes open and he said, can I use that image? And I said, not sure. We'll have to talk to David. And so David said, yeah, he was happy. So that's when it was first released.
Yep.
And then Geoff picked it up in 2013.
For the V&A exhibition.
And in fact, I guess there's a younger generation that think that is the Aladdin Sane image, but
because this is the miracle, I think, you see, that they're all beautiful. It's beautiful, it's wonderful to be able to see them all. It's such a gift to see this fantastic photo session and to be able to look at them all, the eyes open, the looking left, the looking right. They're all wonderful, but then you look back at the one that was chosen and you realize what a magical and bold decision that was, because he's not. It would be much more obvious to have those famous mismatched eyes of this man who is, you know, as Geoff mentioned a moment ago, this is the first album that Bowie made after he'd become a star. It's his 6th album, but it's the first album he made as a known pop star. So, you know, with that comes a certain pressure and a certain expectation. So to decide to use the photo with the closed eyes, the downcast face, it's very bold, it's very audacious in that respect. But it's also, I mean, it's clear to me, I think it's clear to me that the reason they went with that one, apart from the fact that it's just such a beautiful shot, is that it's much more enigmatic. We can bring our own interpretations to it. Why is his face downcast? Why are his eyes closed? Is he sad? Is he deep in thought? is he even dead? As you said, is it a death mask? It doesn't matter that we don't know what. There isn't an answer. There are all those possible answers, and that's exactly what David Bowie is all about. It's about bringing your own interpretation to his lyrics, to his images. He relished the idea that it could mean different things to different people. So part of the power of this album cover is its enigma, I think. And the other thing I was going to say, that the actual working process on that day, the fact that David Bowie was someone who loved to work rapidly, he actually liked that. He didn't like things to go on and on for hours. He wanted to get it done quickly, not because he was impatient, but because he thought that, as long as you have talented enough people, the first take is often the best one of a song, or the first, and let's do it quickly, because then we get a spontaneous, honest version, rather than one that we've pondered over for hours and it's the moment has passed, And so having a photographer as talented as Duffy obviously had this simpatico with Bowie, and for Duffy to have brought in this wonderful makeup designer who, again, came up with the goods on the day. Bowie was so impressed that he promptly hired Pierre Laroche to be his makeup designer for the rest of his tour that year. So although Bowie never actually wore that flash makeup again, ever, after that photo shoot, that's an interesting fact, isn't it? He only ever wore it that one time. Pierre Laroche did go on to create more extraordinary facial designs for him. Those sort of discs that he had on his forehead. That's all 1973. That's after the Aladdin Sane cover, because Pierre Laroche was doing them. And on the back of that, Pierre Laroche also did the cover of Pin-Ups, Bowie's next album, the makeup of him and Twiggy, and indeed went on to do other album covers as a result of his work with Duffy and Bowie. He famously did Rocky Horror. He did Tim Curry's makeup for the Rocky Horror Picture Show. This was all Pierre Laroche. So, a great moment of collaboration between all these talented people. It's an archetypal David Bowie thing to have happened. He was the facilitator who allowed this.
And talking about interpretations, or different layers, or different ways in which you can interpret or see an image. In this case, in the Aladdin Sane cover, Jeffrey was touching on a very interesting subject earlier on when we just met. Of course, we all agree that this image must have been revolutionary. I think you said 50 years ago. It still makes a huge impact in whoever sees it for the first time. But in the case of this particular picture and how differently it can be interpreted now and 50 years ago, Jeffrey was pointing at a very interesting subject, which has to do with gender. How gender was seen in the case of Bowie, people wondering, is he a man, is he a woman? Which is something that people of younger generations now in 2023 see in a very different way. So,
I don't know what the law was like in this country, but homosexuality was illegal in Britain till 1967, and this, it hadn't been a law that was fading away. The police were actively entrapping people right up to the law changing in 1967. So this was just 6 years later. So it was still a world that was very much male or female. And what was extraordinary about the image, it has this sort of gender fluidity in it, for want of a better word. But of course, I can see a lot of younger people in the audience. And of course, this is a world before Me Too and Black Lives Matter and diversity. But I think for young people now, it's come a much more significant in it's just him being exactly what he wants to be. He doesn't care what anybody else thinks. It's quite interesting. In London, our National Portrait Gallery is reopening this month. It's been closed for 2 years while they've been redoing the building. And on the guidebook, we were all brought up in a period where, our history was about Queen Elizabeth I, because she had, attacked the Spanish Armada and all those sort of things. But the image that's on the front cover of the guidebook to the new National Portrait Gallery is this image. And Queen Elizabeth I's on the back, looking very fed up. And I think they've done that because I think they think nowadays it's a symbol of a kind of different sort of Britain that's very diverse. I mean, in terms of gender, where people's background comes from. It's interesting. I haven't been to Madrid for 20 years, so it's very interesting just looking at the population of Madrid. Like everywhere in Europe, it's much more mixed probably than 20 years ago. But I think particularly for younger people, this image now has a different sort of resonance to it at the time, that it's about about individuality, where you can choose exactly where you want to be. So it's no longer male, female, but there's a kind of range there, and you just choose where you want to be on it. And I think that's why it's been chosen, and why it's so important today, and why it's reproduced so often. So Chris, when he's not trying to get to Madrid, runs the archive, and he has people requesting this image for uses
every day
from all over the world.
Every day, yeah.
And it's kind of curious because the three great images you see on T-shirts, which is this, the spectrum from Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, and the Rolling Stones Tongue and Lips logo, were all designed in 36 months in 3 years in London, and they've stuck. But this is the one that is, in a sort of way, most adaptable, because you can't alter the Pink Floyd one, it's just kind of fixed. But this one, well, Chris, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's been used on everything from fridge magnets to T-shirts to caps, but I think it's because it's got such simplicity, and it is on a white background. I mean, one of the things with the book, actually, that I thought we could have done was have a book 3 times the size with pictures of other people's interpretations of it, but that got very complicated because when someone does a copy of something that you own, they actually own the copyright. So we would have had to have gone to everyone to do. But that aside, I think it's that simplicity that it can be adapted in so many ways. But just jumping back on a point you made, Nick, about the selection of the image, there's an interesting dynamic here, and we forget there's a paradigm shift in photography when we move from analog to digital. With digital, we take a picture, we look at it, we go, no, I'll do another one. And I don't think I come out of a conventional organic apprenticeship in photography where what you saw was on the film. But there's an interesting point here where with a roll of film, and this was taken on a Hasselblad camera, so there's 12 frames on a roll, and you have backs that you put on the camera. I became a photographer after I worked with Duffy, and all my photography was analog. And as Duffy explains this, it's a bit like a boxing match. You're just looking for the one punch on the chin to knock the guy out. The perfect situation is you get in the boxing ring, you whack him and he falls over, job done. But it never happens like that. There's a lot of posturing and hitting, and one hit knocks him out and you win the match. And it's exactly the same dynamic with photography. But as a photographer, and I suspect there's quite a few photographers in here, and if you shoot analog, you will know when you take the picture and it clicks, if you've been used to taking analog pictures, it's like a flash in your brain. You register it because you can't look at it again and go, is that right? You've got to know, have I got the picture? And I know personally as a photographer, if I didn't get an image within 4 rolls, I didn't have the image. I'd have to completely change it. But you know, or you hope you know, that you've got the picture, okay? Now, when you say about the selection, something else had happened prior to the Aladdin Sane shoot, where Duffy was getting tired of doing shoots and handing them over to record companies, and they would, in his thinking, wreck his pictures. So he started a design company called Duffy Design Concepts, where he would do the photography, he would do the artwork, he would do the typography and lay it out. And Aladdin Sane came under that umbrella of Duffy Design Concepts. So I suspect when Duffy took that picture, when he said to David, close your eyes, and went click, he knew in his head that was it. The rest was just posturing. And of course, he would have made that decision. Of course, he would have shown it to David and DeFries. They would have trusted him and gone, yes, that's it. But Duffy would have selected that picture. And again, as a photographer, you know yourself when you take pictures all the time. I can look through a contact sheet, 6 rolls of film, and I go, that's the picture. You know very quickly because you've been looking at it. You've been positioning it, focusing it, angling it. So all these other pictures in here, I think, are interesting as a process of just to see the machinations of how a session goes. And for fans, I think that's interesting. And after 50 years, when else are you going to release them? I mean, you know, now's the time. So,
of course, it wasn't just the front image of the album, was it? As you said, you know, Duffy did the whole package. So in the gatefold, there's that other photo of David, full length, but with his body sort of airbrushed down to the bottom by that wonderful airbrush artist, Philip Castle, who also, of course, added the sort of watermark on the teardrop or whatever it is on Bowie's collarbone on the front. And Duffy also masterminded, you know, the typography, the back cover with the sort of outline of, that was all part of the studio.
That was an organic process, and it was done. Duffy was a great experimenter in the darkroom, and he used a film called Ag for Contour, which no longer exists, which is like a line film, and he put it through different processes. Sadly, those original negs got thrown away, but it was all experimental. But yes, that was his idea as well. And of course, the typography, he went to Conway's for the Cristal typography, and the whole package really, name, makeup, everything.
Mm-hmm. In any case, we're talking here about a few things, starting from a simple picture, a picture that has been described as simple, straightforward. But of course, the reason why we're talking about it 50 years later, and books are dedicated or written around that image, or exhibitions around it, is because that image is, to me, and to many people as well, a representation of a depth and of a complexity which came from David Bowie himself. Not just a great musician, also an icon, also, I don't know, a very complete artist who, he basically created what he was and what he did through many different aspects of art, performing arts, visual arts, theater. How, in your opinion, because to me this is like, you know, the great enigma of David Bowie, and this picture as the biggest example of him as a creator. How, in your opinion, did all those influences outside music, all his different interests in culture, in life in general, merge into his public persona, and therefore this particular image?
Yeah, I think when I said for many years that will be the image that will be David's legacy. And when David died, 98% of broadsheets had that image on the front. I was in India when I heard the news, and I turned on the TV, it was BBC News, and the first image was the full-length Aladdin Sane shot. But you're hard pushed to find anyone. Often I get asked in situations, what do you do? And I say, I run a photographic archive. And people say, that's interesting, what's that? And I say, it's all legacy pictures. And they delve down a bit more. And there's a shortcut to that. And I say, it's my father's work. Do you know the picture of David Bowie, the flash on? And they go, yeah. And I go, well, that's his picture. Everyone knows that picture. I mean...
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost, of course, it's first and foremost, of course, it's the front cover image of a great album. But it has actually also become almost detached from that album, and it is seen as a work of art. Even if you don't know Aladdin Sane, if you don't know the songs, even if you don't know much about David Bowie, you probably know that picture. And I think part of its power in that respect is it does, it looks like it can hang in a gallery without you having to know what it is. It looks like a Warhol. It does look a bit like the Mona Lisa. It's a portrait, so it does have that sort of identity outside of But going back to what you were saying, as well, I think a really important part of David Bowie's character as an artist, a characteristic of the way he worked, was that he did see everything, the entire package. He had, I think synesthesia is the official term. He once said he wanted himself and the band at this time, to look like how the music sounded. Some people see colours, they literally see colours when they hear music. They think that you know, the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth is green with flecks of orange, and they literally see that. It must be an extraordinary thing, and I think David Bowie did have a touch of that, because he had very firm ideas about what the look of, and throughout his career, not just at the time of Ziggy and the Spiders, of course, you know, he famously changed his looks and changed the way he presented himself and his band on stage, and so the whole sort of creative package, whether it be the set design, the photography, the clothes he was wearing, the videos, it was all part of the same. They weren't a sort of add-on. It was all part of the work of art that he was creating. And he was famously a very receptive person as a creative artist. You know, he welcomed influences, anything that, you know, books that he'd read, films that he'd seen, theatre shows that he'd seen, stand-up comedy, bits of old Quatermass episodes, children's television, anything. It all went into the melting pot. German expressionist cinema, anything. And eventually it would come out in a strange, chewed up, it had been through the Bowie imagination, and bits of it popped out in his music or in his images. Nothing ever went to waste. And when you see an image like this, that's partly what you're seeing as well. You know, the hair colour, everything. He'd seen it in other places. He'd seen fashion shows. He'd seen movies with, you know, and that's part of the magic of Bowie, is that there are so many different, we'll never find them all. We'll never find all the influences. We'll never know all the tens of thousands of things that went through that extraordinary brain and ended up on the cover and in the contents of his albums, you know.
Geoff, you curated the David Bowie exhibition, so you probably explored this aspect of David Bowie, how he managed to gather all these different influences.
Yeah, I mean, when we started thinking about the exhibition with the designers, 59 Productions, they sort of said, we want a kind of image of how you imagine David working, and we found one of these terrible images that you find of children. I can't remember where it was, from India or somewhere in Asia, picking over a rubbish heap. You know, they're looking for little treasures, and that's how we tried to do the exhibition. That this guy was always looking ahead, always looking for new ideas, things that he could bring to people. And I think, you know, part of the importance for him at the time, I mean, you know, for most young people, there were very, very few, particularly if you left school at 16, which most people still did in the 1970s. Only 5% of people in Britain went to university in the 1970s. So if you weren't in that group, basically you left school at 16, and most people still went into factories. You know, it's a very different kind of life to nowadays. And so where would you sort of find any new ideas from? You know, you didn't really get it from the newspapers and things. So David was this constant source of ideas that he was sort of throwing out. And so many people that we met doing the exhibition said, oh, you know, I got this idea about this or that or the other, and it kind of changed my life. So I think he was always fascinated by that, and that his idea was always, you know, he said, don't copy me, find out what you want to do, and be yourself, don't just follow the crowd. And I think, particularly nowadays, that's why this image is so powerful, because it represents something that we're still grappling with in Western culture, which is about the individual, you know, the relationship, you know, are we part of a kind of corporate, you know, country, or are we individuals? And I think you only just have to think of the countries in the world where you couldn't wear a t-shirt with this image. I mean, there's lots of countries in the world where you wouldn't want to walk down the high street with this image on it. And why? Because it's deeply subversive, because it basically says, do what you want to do, be an individual, and authoritarian regimes in the world see that as a direct threat to them. We're alas in a major war that's going on in Europe. You know, I don't think most of us, certainly a few years ago, thought we were going to see this. And you have to ask yourself, which side of the fence does this image stand for? And it stands for the right to be who you want to be. And that's why it's worth spreading around the world, and why David is still relevant today, probably in some ways more relevant, actually, politically, than he was in the 1970s.
Do you know what's so interesting, Geoff? I mean, when you did David Bowie, is the amount of material that you had, and you realise David had been collecting everything from day one. I mean, for me personally, when I went to the opening and the Scary Monsters section with the big album cover blown up, and there was a glass cabinet and I looked in the glass cabinet, and there was a Polaroid of David that Duffy had shot, and there was someone leaning over David, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, that's interesting, because it was shot in my studio. I thought, well, Natasha was there, Richard Shara, the makeup artist, was there, Duffy was there, I was there, who's that? And I went, oh my God, it's me. It was from the back, but I had hair, so I kind of didn't recognise myself. But the point is that David had picked the Polaroid up and just put it in his... And he was a magpie in that sense. Everything that he collected, but from day one. Yeah. And you had an incredible treasure trove there to work from.
Yeah, I mean, his collection really is... I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've seen a lot of collections that musicians have put together, and there are very, very few in the world, if any of you want to plan to do any, because so many bands break up, the manager runs off with everything, the warehouse where it's kept burns down. I mean, there's so many stories about collections. I mean, Madonna has the most extraordinary collection, because you realise, as soon as you go in her collection, you realise why she's such a super successful businesswoman, because she understands the value of intellectual property right and making sure you own the rights to everything. If any of you creators, never get rid of your IP. But really, his is an outstanding collection. And after we did the exhibition, I've just left the V&A actually, one of the things we wanted to do was to ensure the collection didn't end up going to auction and just getting dispersed. And some of you have may seen it in the papers. I don't know if it was in the papers in Spain, but the collection at some point is going to come to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And it will be in a building. It's actually being converted at the moment. It's going to be like an open store. So theoretically, you'll be able to ask for any object, not just Bowie object, any object in the V&A that's not on display, you'll be able to get it out. I don't know if any of you are into fashion, but the fashion collection in the V&A, there's 50,000 costumes and 50,000 accessories, so there's no shortage of material there. But there's enormous amount of material in the archive which we never used. I mean, we had about 50 or 60 costumes. I don't know how many are. There's several hundred. So there are lots of exhibitions to come, not by me, I've done my bit, but so any of you are in the museum world, or I think that what's sort of interesting is that, this is 10 years since we did that exhibition, and I would do it very differently today, because the world that we're in has changed so radically, but I don't think Bowie is any less relevant. I think
more so, if anything.
Well, David was in the wilderness for 10 years before.
Yeah.
That turbocharged his career.
Yeah, and if I may, there are so many things to talk about regarding David Bowie, but one of them, I think a very interesting one would be the music. Actually, we're talking about a pop album that has also been reissued with in this 50th anniversary. And in this book, Aladdin Sane, 50 years, Nicholas Pegg has written 2 articles about 2 of the songs in the album, Panic in Detroit and the Genie. We kind of hinted earlier something like, could this be, for once, an album that's been obscured by its cover, or certainly not become as iconic and as famous as the image that presents it. Also, I would point at its predecessor, Ziggy Stardust, as the most thought about album from Bowie from the 70s. But we shouldn't forget that this was actually a great album, and a very interesting part of the evolution of Bowie's music in the 70s. Ziggy Stardust in America is the usual description, but what can be said about the music in the Aladdin Sane album?
It's an incredibly important album in Bowie's journey, not least because, as Chris mentioned a little while ago, or was it Geoff? One of you mentioned a while ago, it's the first album that Bowie made after he had become a star. So it's his 6th album. He'd made 5 albums before, and of course they include some amazing albums, Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust, The Man Who Sold the World, wonderful stuff, but none of them were hits until Ziggy Stardust. Aladdin Sane was the first album he made after he'd become huge. and it was indeed his first #1 album. The pre-sales were enormous. In the UK, it was the biggest selling album since the days of the Beatles, and it went straight to #1, which is quite ordinary these days. Album going straight to #1, you need to sell about, I think, 14 copies to do that now. But of course you don't. But it's not. But in 1973, pretty much unheard of. It was a huge, huge success at the time. So yes, you're right. It is a bit odd that, okay, I mean, everyone knows the Genie because that's on all the greatest hits compilations. But yeah, it's funny. Apart from that, some of the songs on the album, maybe people aren't that familiar with. If they hear the title track, they go, "What is this with this weird jazz piano solo that goes on and is crazy?" So it is weird. It's almost in some ways a sort of forgotten album, weirdly, because of course it was hugely listened to at the time. But it's incredibly important as well because, well, like every Bowie album, it moves his journey on another step. One of the wonderful things about Bowie is that every single Bowie album stands as a artistic, a work of art in its own right, but it's also a stepping stone between the previous album and the next album, every single time. Ziggy Stardust, the album, is exactly halfway between Hunky Dory and Aladdin Sane, in terms of what it sounds like. And, you could find other parts of his career where you could say exactly the same. Station to Station is sort of halfway between Young Americans and Low. That's a fascinating little middle point, isn't it? So when you look at the whole journey, it makes total sense. But if you look at a really early album and then go to Black Star, you go, wow, look at that. That's totally, what a journey. But each little step of the way makes total sense. And I think what's interesting about, yes, Ziggy in America was how he described it at the time. And it is almost a sort of second helping of Ziggy Stardust, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. Partly the introduction of Mike Garson, the great jazz pianist, brings a whole new dimension to the album that isn't there on Ziggy Stardust. That's one of the extraordinary things about it. But the other thing, and again, it's to do with the fact that it was the first album he made after he'd become a great success, is that its subject matter is suddenly quite different. Ziggy Stardust is an album that is all about being a star. It's got a song called Star on it in which he sings, I could make the world transformation as a rock and roll star. How exciting to play the part. He's dreaming of being a star. There are 4 songs on that album with Star in the title. Starman, Lady Stardust, Ziggy Stardust, Star. It's almost obsessive, but it's an aspirational. He's not a star yet. He's dreaming about what it would be like to be a star. He's playing the part of a star. By the time he comes to make Aladdin Sane, he is a star, and suddenly he's writing songs that are really quite bleak and about how horrible it is to be a star and the emptiness of it and impending apocalypse. That he also resurrects a song from a few years earlier called The Prettiest Star and puts a new spin on that. But yeah, Aladdin Sane is full of images of kind of urban meltdown and the destruction of society and raddled old actors paying for sex in Hollywood. And, it's a very bleak view of celebrity, but it is still, it's a subject that did fascinate him, clearly, right up until many years later. The Stars Are Out Tonight, the song he did on The Next Day with Tilda Swinton in the video, is a song all about the sort of craziness of celebrity, and of course Fame, another of his very well-known songs. So it was a subject that fascinated him, the sort of gilded cage of fame and fashion. You see it right early on in Space Oddity. The papers want to know whose shirts you wear. What an amazing line. That's a line about how Major Tom has become famous, but it's about, the papers want to know whose shirts you wear. Fame and fashion, all there in David Bowie's first hit. It's one of his abiding preoccupations. And Aladdin Sane is the first time you really see it in this very bleak light, as he's touring around America, not having the greatest time, I don't think. Obviously enjoying the trappings of stardom and enjoying the concerts, but not really enjoying the life in between that. The limos and the hotels and the sycophants and everything that goes with it. And this is the result. It's a brilliant album. Songs like Drive-In Saturday, Lady Grinning Soul, incredible songs. It's one of his best albums. It's one of the best albums. Full stop.
It might sound a kind of slightly weird take on this, but it's estimated that in London there are 60,000 people who work in PR and marketing today. And Alan Edwards, he was Bowie's PR person in London, still does the estate's public relations. He started in the mid to late 70s, and he always likes to say, he said, when I started in PR, there were only 6 people in PR in London, he said, and 5 of them are now in prison. Which was sort of true. And I think that's one of the extraordinary things, that the whole nature of fame at that time was so different to how it is nowadays, that you could really get closer. I always remember when Alan talked. He loved Debbie Harry, and he wanted to do her PR. So he went to a concert in London, in Camden Town, and went round the back and knocked on the door of her, changing room, until someone turned out, and they said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I want to become your PR person," and he did. And I think we're now so used to all these stars having so many layers around them of advisors on this, advisors on that, advisors, what wear, what shoes, what sponsorship you're doing, what programming. David did it all because he didn't actually have any assistants. It was him and obviously his wife at the time and Tony DeFries. But there's 3 or 4 people managed this extraordinary process and drew in people like your father.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's very interesting. If you think about where we've got to with celebrities and the Andy Warhol adage, everyone be famous for 15 minutes, the PR and the press, anyone who's trying to make it in the music business gets a hit and they got to have another hit within 2 or 3 months, otherwise they're dropped. David went, all of our lives, he was there in the background doing something, whether you like it or you don't like it, and it grew organically over those 50 odd years. But I don't think there'll ever be an artist like David, because the zeitgeist is not there for that to happen anymore. You're just going to get sound bites of lots of people coming and disappearing, which is what we've got with celebrity. I mean, look at Pop Idol. How many people that you've seen on, not that I watch it, but I mean, it's been going on long enough. There's only one person I can think of who had some kind of success, was Leona Lewis. But people come and go, come and go, come and go. David sustained 26 albums and 50, that won't happen again.
Yeah, I think also, if you imagined you were Beyonce and you wake up in the morning and it's not just you and you think, oh, I'll write some songs. You've got this huge company that's, you're supporting all these, people. You're running a multi-million-pound business. You're like kind of chief executive, chief creative director, chief everything. It's all on you. And you imagine the kind of pressure. And yet David and a few people were able to do that in the 70s and 80s because everything was in some ways much more simple, and because communication was so difficult. It was I can't remember if I said this earlier, but in 1973, when this came out, only 45% of houses in Britain even had a telephone. And in where I live, you used it for births, deaths, and marriages. You didn't just kind of, and when I took my son's 25, and I say to him, what would you do if you didn't have, they can't imagine a world where you can't communicate with everybody. But at the time, you communicated through music and through the album cover. And I think, if nothing else, Aladdin Sane is the perfect thing where those two things came together to create something really quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Actually, at some point, while preparing this panel, I thought, well, maybe I'll have time to ask these guys not just about the David Bowie from 1973 or the David Bowie from the 90s or from the 70s. I failed miserably. Time has run out, and we're still in 1973. But somebody said 1973. But somebody said before that there will be more anniversaries, more probably exhibitions. Next year it will be the 50th anniversary of Diamond Dogs, then Young Americans, then Station to Station, Low Heroes, Lodger, Scary Monsters, Let's Dance. It's actually the 40th anniversary of Let's Dance this year. Yeah. And it's 10th anniversary of The Next Day. We could even say it's the
30th anniversary of Black Tie White Noise.
An album that I particularly love. I mean,
it's the 60th anniversary of David Bowie's first known recording as a 16-year-old with his group, the Comrades.
Only with anniversaries, probably we could have many other reasons to keep celebrating and honoring the work of this guy. What do you see? I don't know. You just said recently that David Bowie is even more relevant, even more important now than when he was alive. How do you see the evolution of this Bowie recognition all through the next few years?
I think what's really interesting to me has been seeing how David Bowie is still finding new fans, among really young people. They are discovering his work and loving it, and of course they're coming to it without any of the preconceptions that perhaps, you know, fossils of our age grew up with, you know. So we were there for the sort of ups and downs, and oh, now he's not quite so popular, and now he's, you know, I'm a huge fan. I love, for example, David Bowie's 1990s work. Albums like Outside and Earthling, I think, are masterpieces. And one day, quite soon actually, the rest of the world will also realise that. But no, they are. It is at the time there was some of the critics didn't like them. I mean, absolutely wrote them off and said, this is ridiculous. What's he playing at? These are silly records. And of course they're not. They're brilliant. And so, yeah, young people coming to Bowie now, they don't come with any of those preconceptions. It's all just this body of work that they can discover. And I mean, I've met young people who've said, you know, that's my favourite period of Bowie. Earthling's my favourite album, or maybe, you know, all the Berlin albums, or the really early stuff, the 1960s stuff, which, you know, is actually adorable to listen to. You know, and of course the album Toy was released recently, the album that he recorded about 20 years ago, of going back into his old 1960s stuff and revisiting it. So I think that what's interesting now, as I say, is there's this whole body of work that can be discovered, and it feels to me as though that's sort of consolidating in a way, that David Bowie is now held almost in a higher regard than certainly than he was 20 or 30 years ago. You know, that he is now sort of gone beyond the vagaries and the vicissitudes of you know, being popular and then a bit less popular and then back up again, and now he's got a hit and now he's got a flop. None of that matters anymore. It's all the quality of the work is what matters, and it's all brilliant. And people are discovering it and loving it. And I genuinely believe, you know, some artists burn very brightly in their lifetimes, and, you know, not just music, it could be novelists or painters or filmmakers, whatever it is. Sometimes they have a sort of very brief, bright period, and then they rather get forgotten, you know. And there are pop stars and novelists and whatever who I'm quite sure in 50 or 100 years' time will be practically forgotten. Just as, you know, there was a novelist in the 19th century, Edward Bulwer Lytton, who outsold Charles Dickens 10 to 1. He was the most famous novelist in the world. Who reads Edward Bulwer Lytton now? David Bowie read him, actually, because he refers to him at one point in "Oh, You Pretty Things," but that's by the by. That's David Bowie for you. But you know, my point I'm trying to make is that some people's work survives, persists, and goes on, and becomes immortal, and I genuinely believe that David Bowie is one of those people. For as long as people are listening to music, and long after we're all gone, I'm quite sure that people will still be listening to David Bowie. So, you know, I think it's all good.
Mm-hmm. Well, all I can say is thank you to these three gentlemen who have done their bit for David Bowie's work to linger on and still be as relevant as ever. So thank you so much. Then this is it from me, but I'm sure somebody in the audience has any questions to ask Chris or Jeffrey or Nicholas. Por favor.
It's you.
Oh, we have one here. Sorry. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we have spell.
Can you hear me?
Is that one working?
I think it. Yeah. This is for you. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all. It's been great. We're coming from Barcelona only for the event and the exhibition, and. Well, first I want to say that it's great that you're doing this kind of exhibitions. This David Bowie's, which was spectacular. I saw it in London, in Barcelona a few times. We met in Barcelona, in fact. And for doing this kind of books, this is what we need. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And the question, you have talked about David. Well, at home it's David, it's not Bowie. It's part of my family. I'm a fan for many, many years. And my question is not about him as an artist, but as a person. You have met him personally, all of you. If you can describe him in one word or one short sentence, your perception of him, as a person, I was saying, not as an artist, but having him.
Well, actually, I think only Chris got
Chris. I thought you had
to know him.
Sorry.
Deep and complex, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was an ordinary guy. If you were with him, I mean, we treat people based on what we know about them. If you didn't know he was a superstar and you met him, you'd think he was just like a normal bloke, and he was. It had a great sense of humour, but intense in as much as everyone's pointed out. He was. I mean, David was essentially interested in David. Really, he had this. He wanted to be a star. Although at one point, actually, I interviewed a journalist called George Perry, who worked for the Sunday Times, and he's quoted actually in the Taken show we've got there, when he spoke to David, and David said, "I hate rock and roll." He said, George said to him, "Well, what would you rather do?" He said, "I want to be a designer." But he was so well read on everything. So, and again, that's why I think Duffy and David got on so well. They were both very well read, and the time that I spent around David, which was basically listening to him and my dad talk, was on another level because they were into so many esoteric things. Buck Henry, who was David's lawyer in the film The Man Who Fell to Earth, is quoted again in, I think, in the exhibit there, of talking about David turning up to the set in his black limo with his driver, Tony Messina, yeah. And the car was full of books. I mean, there he was going on location to do a film, and he took hundreds of books with him. So, he read everything, looked at everything. I mean, you just look at the art collection he sold recently. Yeah. Really quite left field, really. So, on one level, he was normal, a normal guy. On another, you had to work pretty hard to keep up with him, I'd say, but mixed in with a sense of humour, a great sense of humour.
My experience of David Bowie was of someone who was very kind, and as you said, had a great sense of humour, because my book, The Complete David Bowie, it first came out quite a long time ago now, 23 years ago, and it's been through quite a few new editions since then. And so whenever a new edition came out, my publishers sent a little package of copies over to New York to David's office, because David had asked to have some, and so, you know, what a privilege, really. And he was always very kind and very supportive about my book. But every time, without me ever asking, he used to write a little message in one of the copies and sign it and send it back to me. So I still have those, of course, and as you can imagine, they're among my most prized possessions. And he always wrote a funny little thing in. You know, my favourite one is, he wrote in one of the editions, he wrote, "Nick, congratulations, an amazing achievement. Of course, it's all completely wrong." And he signed it, a little smiley. So, but no, he had a wonderful sense of humour, and he was so kind. He didn't have to be. He could have ignored me. He didn't need me, you know. But he was very kind about my book, and I really, you know, that means the world to me. It really, really does. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other question? Yes. Oh. There you go.
Hello, I'm 21 years old. I've been quite a fan of David Bowie since I was 15, more or less. I have 3 Bowie tattoos in my body.
Oh, and a nice t-shirt as well.
Yeah, my t-shirt too. And my question is, how you became to be a Bowie expert, because that probably will be my dream job.
So these are Bowie experts. I don't know how this translates into Spanish, but I'm what we say in English, I'm a jack of all trades and master of none, because I worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum for 18 years, and I looked after theatre, opera, dance, musical theatre, popular music. So you have to know a little bit about everything. So when we did the exhibition, it was very reliant on people like Nick and Chris, who were very generous with lending objects and their advice and all the rest of it. But I think there's something which goes to the heart of knowing about what David was really interested in, and I think it's something that goes to the heart of what everybody in the room, and I think we're all facing at the moment. It may sound an odd thing to say, is what actually does democracy, in a way, mean to us? Because when I was growing up, I went to university, all my lecturers were Marxists. I don't know what it was like here, probably very different. But everybody had this vision of the future. There was social progress, and we're all heading towards this city on the hill where everything was going to be. It was all going to be like Sweden. There was going to be, social justice and all the rest of it. And that's all evaporated. So everywhere in Europe, whether we're in the EU or not, we all say we stand for democracy, but what actually does that really come down to when there are so many sort of problems? And I think what it comes down to, certainly, or what it would be if David was sitting here, was about the right to be yourself, not to be something that a politician has told you to be, but to be about yourself. That's what the debate in the world, I think, at the moment and for the next decade is about. And I think that's why David is highly relevant now. And I think if you really want to become an expert in David, it's not by being a museum curator or even as a historian. It's about thinking about that issue, because it's something that affects everybody in this room, it affects everybody in Madrid, and it affects everybody in Western Europe. What do we think are the values which are which are represented by the countries that we live in, by Europe? And that is being tested now in a very, very deeply unpleasant and dangerous way. And somebody asked me, what would be the things that I'd ask David now? And I would be fascinated with what he would think about the world we're in now. And what he would be doing about it, because he was deeply apolitical. I mean, he did one concert in his entire life, I think it was 1969, which was raising money for Wales, wasn't it? I think at the
Wales, the large
not
mammals,
Wales, the
not
country.
the country. Yeah.
But he was very, very apolitical in a conventional sense. I don't think he'd ever been.
Well, he did write songs in which he, confronted neo-Nazism and things like that, for example. There's a song called Under the God that he did with Tin Machine, which is very unambiguously about the rise of the far right, and he was not a fan of that, quite clearly, and thank goodness for that. So, he did make, but he certainly never sort of signed up to any particular political party or anything like that, certainly not, no.
Yeah. So it's sort of slightly answering your question. If you wanted to become, you can read all the books. So when we did the exhibition, there were about 50 books on David Bowie. We actually photographed a pile, and now the pile's up here, getting higher. So you can write a book, and so there's another one here. But actually, I think if you really want, is to think about how he would see the world now, because that's actually what his relevance today is. Maybe that's not the answer you wanted.
I became, if I am a Bowie expert at all, I became one just by being a fan, really, because I'm not a music journalist. I'm not someone who writes about, Madonna and Michael Jackson and the Beatles as well. But I mean, occasionally have mentioned them in passing, but I'm actually an actor most of the time and a writer. I write other things. But the reason I wrote my book about David Bowie was simply because I loved his music so much. And at the time I wrote the first edition of my book, although there is a pile this high now, there wasn't really at the time a book that. There were lots of biographies of his life, which is a fascinating life, but there weren't really any books that looked at his body of work, and particularly, as I was mentioning early on, the body of work, the parts of his work that tended to get ignored, the 1990s albums. All the books I'd read got about as far as Scary Monsters, perhaps, or maybe Let's Dance, and then sort of hit the accelerator and went through the rest of his career sort of in about 10 pages because they didn't think it was worth discussing. So I wanted there to be a book that gave everything equal value, and I rather pompously thought, well, if no one else is going to write it, I'll have a go. So I just started doing it in my spare time, really, in between work as an actor, and eventually found a publisher who was crazy enough to give it a go, and it seemed to catch on, which was nice. So really, I just did it out of being a fan. So go for it.
Nick, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, going from fan, transitioning to expert. I haven't spent enough time with you, but I've spent time with Kevin Can. And I can tell you, I'm no expert on Bowie. I know the bits that I know. But if you hang out with Kevin, people flock to him. And they are true fans. And they will arm wrestle you to the ground, arguing about whether David had Rice Krispies or Cocoa Pops on the 6th of April, 1978. There's that obsession with it. And that's not a level I'm on. You are the experts, you and Kevin. And all the other guys in the book, which is actually, bringing it back to the book, was the way that I'd viewed putting that together. I'm not a writer. And I thought I would take a leaf out of David's book and harness the energies and expertise of other people, because the first book I did with Kevin, 5 Sessions, which is about all the sessions Duffy did with David, I interviewed all the people that were connected with that, and that's very much what the Taken exhibit is. But with Aladdin Sane, because not everybody's here, Mick Ronson, Trevor Boulder, I thought, why not have this from the outside looking in? And what better to give the 5 top Bowie writers 2 songs each to do a dissertation on, held together with The Glue by Geoff as a social historian. And I think it actually, I mean, I put in the book, I hope David and Duffy will be happy with that approach. And I think it has really worked. Yes. But you guys are the experts. But to answer your question, I mean, Mark Adams, who runs the fan club, uber fan. I mean, you go to his house, honestly, it's insane. He's got 3 floors. He took me around recently. You cannot move. He's pulling things out from, he's got so much stuff. And you learn from that. If that's, I mean, I think education is about that, really. You can't teach anyone anything. If you're interested in something, you'll teach yourself, and that's how you become the expert.
Yeah. Just to say that there's lots of stuff still to come out. The V&A we bought, in the exhibition, there's a copy of the script of The Man Who Fell to Earth. I don't know who it was.
It was Nick Rogue's. Oh, well, it was his original.
I'm sorry. We at the V&A we bought when Nick died. We bought must be another one, a copy of the of the script of the film, and it's an extraordinary thing because stuck in it are masses of photographs and all sorts of things cut up and things stuck on every page. You got the text on one side, the blank sheet, and it's like the story of the making of the film with bits of Polaroids and all sorts of things. Unfortunately, they're all stuck in with that. I don't know what do you call it in Spanish. It's like cow gum. It's like
copy decks.
It's like so all the glue's gone. So old glue. So it's being restored at the moment. So they're all going to be fitted. So that's an extraordinary account by someone who was very close to him, which has never been seen by anybody. So there's all sorts of other things. So it's not like it's all done.
Okay, I think this is it, and I would just like to say one last thing. I don't know, from being a fan, you can become many things. In my case, I became a music journalist and a radio guy from being a fan of David Bowie and many other artists. But anyway, I'm sure everyone here in this room is a fan of David Bowie's. And same as he was influenced by, lots of things, different writers, artists, musicians, filmmakers, whatever, I'm sure about something. Everyone here has been somehow influenced by David Bowie at some point, as people as young as her, older people like myself, or I don't know. So I think a very nice way to finish this presentation would be saying thank you, David, and thank you, of course, to Chris Duffy, Geoffrey Marsh, and Nicholas Pegg. Lovely spending this time with you, and it's been beautiful. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you all. Gracias a todos y todas los que habéis venido para acompañarnos. Ha sido un placer también. Okay. So this is it. Oh, y una última cosa. Chris, Geoffrey y Nicholas van a estar ahora en esa mesita firmando libros para quienes tengáis copias del libro y para que sigáis hablando con ellos también un ratito si queréis con ellos. Así que nada más. Muchísimas gracias de nuevo. Un placer.